Assalamu alaikum, SherShah Khan.
Walaikum salam.
Uh, Hello, guys. Welcome to Behind the Mic, the podcast by Roshni. I'm Shamal Khan, the chief analyst at Roshni, and today we are decoding Islamic intellectual history, its origins and developments, and the causes of its decline. Our guest for today is SherShah Khan. SherShah is a dedicated student of Islamic intellectual history, philosophy, and theology. With over 3 years of self-directed study, he actively promotes scholarly work in these fields through his social platforms, where he interviews renowned scholars and fosters a space for youth to engage with global academic perspectives. Anything you'd like to add, SherShah?
No, that's enough. Thank you.
Okay. So, Shirsha, before we go into the questions for the audience, can you tell us about your life and how you reached where you are now?
Okay.
So you were saying
Yeah, yeah.
you
So
moved to.
I was born in North Waziristan, Shimali Waziristan, and we moved to Peshawar in 2008 um, due to a civil war, basically, which started between
Mm,
me and the Taliban. So I think since then I've been living in Peshawar, or I think the major change in my life happened in 2019-20, when I think this was like the initial moments when I started discussing these topics with other students at Edwards College. But later on in 2020, I took a gap year. And I think the gap year was like the turning moment in my life when I was just at home and I tried to explore different ideas, different subjects like psychology and philosophy. And later on, I moved towards Islamic intellectual history. Um, and then the rest is just history. I took on social media, and I've been utilizing uh, those platforms for spreading intellectual history and related fields. So that's a little background.
Thank you for sharing your insights. Let's move on to the questions. My first question is, what in your opinion was the Islamic intellectual history, and what were the main concepts discussed among the scholars at the time?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult one to answer because um, Islamic philosophers, Islamic theologians, we have a track record of like 1200 years. And they basically discussed every single topic, whether it's metaphysics or astronomy, physics, logic, everything. Um, but I think if I could like point out some famous topics that they really debated on, that would be existence. So existence was one of the major discussion points that philosophers from every school talked about. Um, and so I think if you look at the origins of Islamic intellectual tradition, basically if you look at the beginning of those philosophical discussions, so at that time the attributes of God is one of the earliest debated topics. Concepts like determinism, predeterminism, and free will are also one of the earliest topics that are discussed by the Mu'tazili. So the Mu'tazili are considered to be the earliest philosophers of Islam, and so I think they were at the forefront of debating with Christians and also developing
Mm,
these things. And later on, I mean, it's such a vast tradition that it's impossible to generalize it. But
mm.
this is like some of the topics that they talked about over the centuries.
Yeah. So, Shirsha, my second question to you is, can you highlight some of the major scholars and their contributions in fields like science, philosophy, and medicine? Been a
Yeah,
tough one.
that's an interesting one. Thank you for asking. So I think most people are aware about figures like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn
Mm,
Rushd, Jabir ibn Hayyan. I think when I was in school, um, in my physics textbook, there was a section at the end of chapter one, um, and that section was devoted to great Muslim thinkers in science, in physics. So that was the first time I heard the names of Ibn Sina, Farabi, Kindi, Jabir ibn Hayyan, Al-Jahiz, and those guys. But um, and certainly, I think these figures they were like masters in their field. If you take the example of Ibn
mm,
Sina, he was a giant, not only in in philosophy and theology, but also medicine. But I think there are certain scholars that who were, really, central to our intellectual tradition. But unfortunately, they're not as well known. So, for instance, Fakhruddin al-Razi is someone who is not well known amongst like
Yeah.
the masses. Rarely do I find some. I mean, whenever I ask people who are interested in this field in Islamic intellectual history, they might have heard about Fakhruddin Razi, but they have no idea what were his ideas. And there is a valid reason to this, which is that most of his works are still in Arabic and they're not translated into English. And English is like the language where I think this information is usually transmitted. So
Yeah.
on platforms, YouTube, people are conversing in English. And Urdu, there is absolutely like no material available in Urdu of Fakhruddin Razi. And he's just like one guy. Also have Suhrawardi, who was executed by Salahuddin in 1194. You have figures like Sadruddin Qunawi. And then in the Shia tradition, you have Mullah Sadra, who is well known in the academic circles. But I think when it comes to the masses in general, there is little awareness. And there's one figure like Imam Ghazali who is well known, but unfortunately, a lot of the attention a lot of the attention he gets is actually negative. Like people think that he was the someone who literally stopped science. He was the cause of the death of sciences in the
Yeah.
Islamic world.
I've heard that he was the obstacle to
Yeah,
academic.
yeah, which is not true. Actually, I mean, if we take a different perspective, actual philosophy, like robust philosophy, systematic philosophy, begins after Ghazali. Once the
Mm.
clash happens. So we can look at it this way: in the classical period of Islam, so that is from the 8th century till the 11th century. Like that's the period of like 300 years, 400 years. In the classical period, you had Kalam and Falsafa as two dominant trends or two dominant schools of philosophy. So Kalam is also a philosophy
Mm.
school, and they have their own assumptions, their own arguments, their own worldview about
Yeah. Rational
nature.
discourse on faith.
Yeah, exactly. Nature, God's attributes. And then you have the Falsafa tradition, which is a continuation of Aristotelian slash Neoplatonic slash
Yeah.
Plotinus.
Integration of Greek philosophical works, right?
Yeah, so it's the continuation of Greek metaphysics in Arabo-Islamic tradition. That's a good way to frame it. And then you have this guy Ibn Sina who intervenes and he radically changes, the discourse. So Falsafa after Ibn Sina is the continuation of Greek metaphysics, Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism, and now the original contribution of Ibn Sina. And that's how the later tradition progresses. So Kalam is progressing, it's developing, and Falsafa as well. And then there's a clash between these two schools in the form of Imam Ghazali and his book Tahafut al-Falasifa. That's like when he criticizes the Falsafa tradition on 20 metaphysical points. Um, and then because of this collision, this interaction, the later tradition, so what we call that the post-classical tradition, the later Islamic tradition is where you have systematic developments and you have systematic synthesis of these two schools. So really, like robust philosophy begins after that. So this is a rough sketch of.
Can you shed some light on Ibn al-Haytham al-Hazin
Yeah.
19? Yeah.
So Ibn al-Haytham, again, he's also an important figure, especially when we look at the Islamic scientific tradition. So developments, certainly in optics, like optics was his main area, but astronomy
Mm.
as well. He wrote a treatise in which he criticized Ptolemy and his astronomical observation on philosophical grounds. The story is very long. We don't have to get into it, but Ibn al-Haytham is certainly very, very, very important
Yeah.
when it comes to liberating the Islamic scientific tradition from the constraints of Aristotelian cosmology and Aristotelian physics. Ibn al-Haytham is certainly an important figure. He was one of the pioneers who actually liberated the Islamic tradition from those philosophical metaphysical constraints. Al-Biruni is another
Mm.
important one. and they contributed to the development in Islamic scientific tradition later on.
Yeah. My third question to you is, what was the role of institutions like Bayt al-Hikma in fostering intellectual growth?
Yeah, okay, this is an interesting one. Thank you for asking again. Um, so recently, I've had a change of mind with regards to Bayt al-Hikma, Baghdad. Uh, I'm
Yeah.
actually going to make a reel today about this topic, like Bayt al-Hikma, Baghdad, so it's going to be out soon. But so I think a lot of people believe that Baghdad in the 11th or 12th century, 13th century was the center of, literally like the center of learning, center of civilization. And Bayt al-Hikma was like this research institute where the greatest scholars from around the world were there, and they were, making progress in all those sciences. But my recent understanding is different, and in certain respect, it's actually quite the opposite. So the first point is that Baghdad. So in 1258, when the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, um, the Islamic intellectual tradition did not die out. This is the usual narrative that people have. The usual belief that Mongols invaded Baghdad and they destroyed Bayt al-Hikmah, and that was the end of Islamic sciences, rational sciences. But this is
And
not
that's the
true.
general view.
Yeah, this is not true, and literally like everyone believes this. Um, but if we read the academic sources which have recently come out, if you read that, you'll find out that Baghdad was not even as badly hit as other Persian cities like Tus and Nishapur. Like those cities,
Yeah.
Tus and Nishapur, they were badly hit. They were like literally burned to the ground, and they had to be revived in different regions, like different locations. Whereas Baghdad started recovering after a month of its invasion. And as far as just one more point, if you look at the chronicles of Muslim travelers in the 14th and 13th and 14th century, they describe Baghdad as a flourishing city. Again, this is like after the invasion, and they're describing Baghdad as a flourishing city where colleges and universities and hospitals are functioning, and so it's a really stable environment. um, so that's I think important point. Another interesting point, and this is regarding Bayt al-Hikmah, which you mentioned. um, People have this wrong perspective that Bayt al-Hikmah was like the only center in the Islamic world where sciences were, developing. This is wrong. And the second is that Bayt al-Hikmah was not even a research institute the way that people describe it, like as if this was like a research institute and people would like, making advancements in science, philosophy, etc. The right way to see Bayt al-Hikmah is that it was a library of sort.
Yeah.
It had section for copyists as well, translators and copyists. So if there were books written in philosophy, they were like, making copies of it, or
Transcripts of those.
yeah, exactly, those things. It wasn't as central and important as people make it out to be. In the 13th century, 14th century, you have many centers of learning. For example, in Cairo, you have Egypt is a center of learning.
Yeah.
In If you look at Central Asia, right? So in the 14th, 15th century, you have Samarkand, Bukhara. Those are the places where scholars are going for learning. And this is also the era where Ottoman Empire is also rising. So they're also, trying to stabilize the borders and also inviting scholars in their region. So Baghdad was definitely not the only place where these developments were happening. In the 13th century, you already have a fragmented Islamic political world. So the Islamic world is divided into many political, systems like different sultanates, and they have their own centers of learning.
Yeah.
So in Egypt you have one, and then you have in Syria, in
The
Damascus.
Turks.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
Turks. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a lot of myths regarding Bayt al-Hikmah and Baghdad. If you're interested in this topic, you should read this book, which is recently published. It's called The House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah, The House of Wisdom, Between Myth and Reality. It's a book published by a Turkish scholar. So it's I think he really he cites primary sources, and he paints a different picture. The idea that Bayt al-Hikmah was like the only center of learning and Mongols destroyed it, and that caused the end of the Islamic rational sciences. This is a myth propagated by many Orientalists who have a soft side for Islam, who had a soft side for Islam. But this was wrong. This entire analysis is wrong.
Yeah. Blame shift was one of the reasons, right? कि भाई हमारा तो इस्लाम अच्छा जा रहा था लेकिन मंगोल्स ने हमको
Yeah.
वो कर दिया।
In fact, there is a flourishing tradition under Mongol Empire, which most people
या
are not aware of. For instance, so in 1258, the invasion happens and Baghdad is destroyed, but not as badly. In 1259, you have the biggest astronomical observatory built in Maragha, which is in modern day Iran, and it's funded by Mongols. So, so I think that this one example is enough to, you know, just put
and
this
even
huge.
if Mongols did hit Baghdad, after that time, in the 13th and 14th century, the golden age of Ottoman Empire started, and they could have regained the knowledge they lost. And do you agree in this?
Yeah, they did. Like I said, once you start looking at Baghdad and Bayt al-Hikma as not like the only centers, the exclusive centers of learning and prosperity and civilization, then you have a different understanding. Because, like I said, this was the era where where you had different political systems, you had different sultanates, and they had their own centers of learning. So the Mongols had their own centers of learning, and the Mongols were sophisticated in many ways. I think the usual depiction of Mongols as this bloodthirsty animals who are just like ravaging city after city is just wrong. Their invasion of cities and their certain destruction of certain cities was systematic. It was just to scare off the other empires. So and like I said, the Mongols definitely had their own intellectual tradition. Um, so if you look at if we track the progress of Islamic astronomical tradition, you'll find that by the time you reach the time of Tusi, um, uh, you know, uh, Qutbuddin Shirazi, and others, they are making great advancements in these fields. So it certainly didn't die out. This is a myth. And like I think George Saliba said in his book, Islamic Sciences and the Making of European Renaissance, he says that the golden age of Islamic astronomy begins after Ghazali and it matures in the 17th century. And from then
Mm,
on, we see a decline in the development in scientific tradition. Although the developments are happening in logic tradition, in philosophical tradition, in theology, but we do see a decrease in advancements in science by the 17th and 18th century. So, and this is, I think, the area where we can. I mean, there's still a lot of research going on. What actually
mm,
happened to Ghazali? What actually happened after Ghazali? Scholars are still debating this in terms of what were the actual developments that happened, because we still have not understood entirely. Just
yeah.
to give you an example, recently two books came out by Professor Peter Adamson. They're called The Heirs of Avicenna, and those books are talking about the philosophical, theological, and logical developments in 12th and 13th century Islamic East. So you have Islamic West, that's Maghrib. It includes Andalusia and northern African countries like Libya and Morocco. Peter Adamson and other scholars, they track developments in philosophy and theology and logic in Islamic East. So that is like countries beyond, like countries to the east of Egypt. So you have
Mm,
Syria, you have Iraq, Iran, and then later on India as well. So what were the developments that happened? And those two books, like they're massive volumes, 700 pages, and it's just sheer robust philosophy that is happening afterwards. So yeah, but the thing is,
so,
we have no idea what happened in 14th century, in 15th century, and we certainly have no idea what happened in 16th and 17th century. Like this research is just like happening right now in front of our eyes, and I think it's a great opportunity for like learners like us to really benefit from this, to engage with these
mm,
scholars who are doing these research. So yeah.
okay. Let's move on to our fourth question. Islamic intellectual history is often celebrated for its golden age, which spans several centuries. In your opinion, what were the main periods of this golden age? What were some of the prominent works produced during this time, and who were the key academics and intellectuals that shaped this era? I think this is a repeat of the first two questions, but
So I think there are a few points that I'll share, but you're right that we have gone through that description of Islamic tradition and how we developed. But there are certain points that I want to add. The first is that this idea of a golden age is itself problematic. It was coined by Orientalists. Um, so basically, they want to say that Islam had a flourishing. This is the Orientalist myth about the golden age. So the golden age started because Greek philosophical texts were translated into Arabic, and then Arabs started learning those texts, and then they preserved those texts, and basically this was the golden age. Muslims are, they are highly civilized because of Greek philosophy, and because they preserved Greek philosophy, that's how the West got it later on. But unfortunately, Imam Ghazali comes in, he writes a book, and he refutes philosophy as a whole, and that leads to the decline in science. So this is the Orientalist myth. This is totally wrong, because even if you accept this narrative, you have certain questions. For example, why did Arabs even, thought of translating these obscure philosophical texts? If they were so like backward and they had no idea of philosophy and these sciences, who told them that these sciences are actually beneficial for you? Because here's an interesting point. From the first century CE till the 7th century CE, there was virtually no science happening in the entire world. Like, this is an important point. There was no science happening in Byzantine Empire. There was no science happening in the Sassanid Empire, the Persians. And out of nowhere, Arabs are taking over these lands, and they are asking scholars and people of those empires to find out those texts, those texts which are not even in the centers of those empires. They are like in obscure pockets, in obscure cities. So then the question becomes, why would Arabs, like these backward desert Arabs, ask these people to bring out those philosophical texts which are in obscure towns and obscure cities? Like, this is a major question, and Orientalists have no answer to this. They were like, I don't know, Arabs just woke up one day and decided that, you know what, I'm going to study Aristotle and what he has to say about, the heavenly bodies. Like, it makes no sense. And when you look at the research, if you look, which has been done recently, if you look at the research about these early decades and like early centuries, you'll find out that Arabs and Muslims, Persian Muslims and Arabs, they had a they had built their own systems. They had a sophisticated understanding of of literature, how to interpret a text. Like, they had developed their own rational methods, even logical methods of interpreting a text, and reasoning, how to reason, etc. And part of the reason was that because Muslims were trained in their own indigenous disciplines, like the hadith studies, where you have to check the sanad, the transmission of the report, where you have to interpret the text. Like, these are the sort of activities that demand mental energy. It's not easy. Like, if you look at the hadith sciences, it's not easy. It's not something that anyone can do. You have to be really careful with it. And likewise, tafsir, the exegetical tradition that developed, you'll find that they were having robust conversations about you know the meaning of the verse and like the overall Quranic worldview. And likewise, there was a systematic development in Arabic grammar as well. Like, so all of these sciences were developing, and as a consequence, Muslim scholars were well versed. Like, they had an idea about what reason is, and to deploy your rational methods in understanding text. And like I said, the Mu'tazili are considered to be the earliest, like the original philosophers of Islam, because they were like the earliest people who debated philosophical questions with Christians, and those who were espousing Greek philosophy. And this was not because they had learned Aristotle and Plato's ideas. Like, they were debating about God's existence and the attributes of gods. Like, if you look at the Kalam tradition, for the Kalam tradition, the attributes of God is like a major point. Like, this is how they started off. So this is a major point for them. And they started off on their own, and later on they come in contact. Like, in the 9th century, they come in contact with Greek texts when the translation movement happens. But before the translation movement in the 8th century and also in 7th century, Muslims had an understanding. They know how to, like, they're not stupid. They know how to deploy rational methods and all. They have certain understanding of astronomy as well, and that later developed. And this was the reason, because Muslims were well versed in these sciences. That's how they developed. That's how they understood the utility of Aristotle and Plato, And that's how they understood the utility of translating these texts and then learning them, and also trying to find a way if some of its elements are in harmony with the Islamic tradition, or if it's not, then what to do with them. So I think this point is really important, like how Muslims started off with the translation movement. There's literally like 2-3 generations of scholars before the translation movement who are well versed in these sciences, in astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. So I think this point is really important, and that debunks the golden age narrative, which is that golden age happened because Muslims translated the Greek texts, whereas the truth is no, Muslims were already well versed in these rational, sciences. Although yes, Aristotle, Plato were definitely important for the tradition for the later period, but you have to understand, like they understood the utility of these sciences because they were already well versed. Um, so I'll stop here.
Yeah, good, a good answer. Uh, SherShah, do you think the language barriers are a reason, is a reason that today in Muslims world, many people don't understand and know the knowledge that's true and real. Instead, they develop views and opinions like we discussed about Bayt al-Hikma and etc.
Well, it has a really long answer, but it also has a short. So I want to know which answer you prefer, the long one or the short one.
Whichever is whichever with you is more comfortable.
Okay, so I'll go for the long one, but I'll try to keep it short. So you mentioned a really important point about language. Like the basic question is the starting question: does language pose a barrier in learning a tradition, a different tradition? Right. So if I know
Yeah.
Pashto and there's a robust tradition in Arabic, um, is it possible for me to like grasp the tradition entirely if I do not learn the language as a tool and only like try to understand this tradition through translated works? And I think this second part of this is that in today's era, it's not just the barrier of language that is stopping us from learning. The other barrier is like academia. Like you have academic level, and then you have social media, YouTube, and those platforms where those topics are being discussed. And it just happens to be the case. I think it's actually natural that people would not everyone will be on that academic level, and they will try to gain information from these platforms like YouTube and Instagram and those things. Um, so we have divisions on two grounds. The first division is that of barrier, like barrier of language, and the second division is that of just in terms of learning. Like you have the academic class, and then you have like us, like really just common people who are reading translated work. With regards to the first division, in terms of like the barrier of language, it's very interesting. If you look at the Islamic, if you study the decline in rational sciences in the Islamic world, one of the major, and if we limit our focus to South Asia, one of the biggest reasons that the rational science, the ma'qulat, declined was because there was a shift in language from Arabic to Urdu
Yeah.
in the 18th, 19th century. And because of this shift, the vocabulary that the scholars had developed since the 14th century, since the 9th, 8th century in Arabic, in like sophisticated vocabulary of logic, philosophy, and theology and science, all that vocabulary that was developing till like the 18th century, suddenly all of Muslims cannot, tap into that because now the language of discourse is Urdu, and this happens in South Asia. Um, another reason um, why the decline in the rational sciences was accelerated was the introduction of print. And so this is the era where scholars are writing in Urdu for the masses generally. And so because obviously masses are not well versed in Arabic and like the technical language, so they try to water down everything and they try to write texts and treatises and books for the masses. And the other reason was, it's also unfortunate that this is the era where the the predominant topic for these scholars is polemical theological issues, not like the continuation of that rational sciences. This is also the era where you have an intense polemical activity that happens in like the colonial India, and this is the reason that this is the era where we have the developments of Deoband, Barelvi, and also Ahl Hadith movement. And their main point of contention is theological. And the rational sciences, which was developed like since the ninth century, is abandoned totally. Like no, apart from the Farangi Mahal, who are well versed in Urdu and Arabic, they are carrying on that tradition, but it's literally they're just like by themselves. Whereas the other schools are developing, and unfortunately the other schools like Deoband Barelvi, they are not huge fans of intellectual sciences. The founder of the Deoband movement, Rashid Ahmed Gangohi, he's very explicit about rational sciences. He says that these are they can lead you to kufr. Even though Qasim Nanotri was a guy who engaged the rational sciences, because he died very early on, like 10 years after the establishment of the Deoband movement, the Darul Ulum Deoband, um, Rashid Ahmed takes over the movement and also the madrasa, the central madrasa, and then his he basically shaped the later curriculum. So this change in language from Arabic to Urdu was detrimental. Like it was really disastrous. All the development of sophisticated vocabulary was left, and all of a sudden Muslim scholars do not even understand what these technical signs are saying. Like you and I, we speak English, but we have no idea what the medical textbook is saying. Why? Because we don't have the vocabulary, we don't have the concepts of what that textbook is saying. So a similar situation happened in South Asia Islamic tradition in 18th, 19th century. Um, so the language. So I think the point that I want to emphasize on here is that we as young students who are learning this tradition, we do have to develop our expertise in language, because it's impossible to learn a tradition uh, fullest sense without learning the language. Like language gives you a certain paradigm that another language will not give you. Like if you know Arabic, that language will give you a certain paradigm, and that would be different if you're well versed in Urdu and you're learning this tradition in Arabic through that translated works. You will not get the full sense of what the tradition is saying. Like to get the systematic overview of the tradition, you have to learn the language. And then there is a whole argument for this, and you can read Izutsu. And like I think Izutsu in his book Ethical Religious Concepts in the Quran, he details this point. How language is very subjective, it's very particular, and to understand the framework of a certain people, of a certain tradition, we have to learn the language, because language and worldview, they're like it's impossible to draw a line between the two. So it's important to learn the language to tap into that technical tradition that we had developed over 1,200 years. And the second point, which is what I'm doing and you're all doing as well, it's bridging the gap between academia and the public. Right? So I think my platform, I try to make sure that whatever the knowledge that I gain about Islamic intellectual tradition, um, I try to spread it in the public, and I also want to I also want the youth of Pakistan to interact with scholars, right? And this will bridge the second divide between academia and public. Um, so this is my perspective on these things.
Yeah, I agree. You know, when I was just a kid, I had started Quran, and my Qari Saab was like, learn this and this and this. And after a while, I started to ask him questions like, why don't I understand anything, and why am I learning in Arabic? He was like, don't ask these questions, and these are kufr and that. And I was like, yeah, uh, Islam is my religion. It's my duty to ask something, and I have to learn the Quran and the meaning of this. And uh, I just finished the Quran, the translated version, and I understood that if we have to bridge the gap between matlab, we have to understand the text first, because if you don't know the meaning, what's the point?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right on this. It's important to encourage people to learn the tradition. Unfortunately, you're right. There is this feeling of uh, trying to, uh, you know, not intervene.
Suffocate
But
the questions we ask,
yeah,
and that's something we should not encourage. We should encourage questions so that people get a better understanding of the things we learn.
yeah, I
So,
mean, sure. Yeah. So
uh,
is there a question coming?
No, if you had something to add,
No, I
please
just want
add.
to agree. Like, I'll just agree with whatever you have said. I think it's true. Our education system is like, failed. It's not
Mm.
failing; it is failed. I don't think that there's a whole story about education. I can rant about it. But yeah.
Yeah, let's move on to the next question. Shesha, do you feel in this modern time the interest level that prevail in theology or Islamic history is declining? If so, why is that?
This is absolutely true. It is declining. I think part of the reason is that even if you look at the history, where the developments were at its peak, and we had great scholars. Islamic intellectual tradition, in terms of theology or philosophy, it was very exclusive. It was exclusive for scholars. It was certain individuals who were doing it. We certainly had no massive state level schools, and so all the developments that were happening even back then, um, it was just like scholars writing for scholars. They were not writing for common people. The genre of writing for the commoners, that because of the print, and the shift from Arabic to Urdu again in South Asia. Once those things were put in place, then you had scholars who were devoting all their energies to writing texts for the audience, for general public. Whereas before that, you had scholars that were writing books for scholars, other scholars. There are exceptions, of course, but I think the general, if you focus on the intellectual version, like logic, philosophy, scholars are only writing for scholars. Um, but today, it's very unfortunate that even if you look at our scholars, they're not interested in topics like the logical development or the philosophical development in our tradition. Um, and the reasons are many. I think the, the primary reason would be that if you look at the Muslim world as a whole, um, and this started on like in the mid 19th century, so 1850, in the Ottoman Empire in India. Muslims suddenly realized that we were lacking technological advancements and economic advancements. So all of a sudden, we had Muslims who are now devoting all their, like Muslim empires and states, they were devoting all their energies to technological advancements and economic development instead of intellectual development. Because there was this race, we had to catch up with the West. And this feeling, this sense has only accelerated after that. And today, I mean, even like look, we go to universities because we think that we'll get a job, and we'll have a house, a home, a family, etc. And I think this is the general, I would say, feeling for everyone. Uh, Nobody wants to devote their lives to a tradition unless you want to become an academic in the West. You get offered a scholarship or the professorship, then you can study this tradition. But there is no, even if you look at Pakistan, we don't have indigenous institutions who are funding research in Islamic intellectual tradition of the 13th, 14th, 15th century or any period. You would have to go to the West in a university, and then you have to learn under a scholar. And this and in the West, I mean, this is where all, like, virtually all the developments is happening. Um, so I think this race that we have to catch up with the West is one reason. The other reason is like this is the age of social media. It's very hard to engage these discussions. So I'm like I tell myself that look, even if I use my social media platforms to encourage youngsters to engage with Islamic history, it's inevitable that only a small minority would be interested in these topics. It's just the nature of these topics that it's impossible that the majority would be interested. Uh, so this is just the nature of academia and academic information. Uh, so
Yeah, adding to that, Shirsha, in my opinion, I think that the sectarianism also divided Islam, and
yeah,
it just destroyed the golden age, and that everything fall into pieces after this the sectarianism and Muslims' interest in theology and this all became irrelevant after this, and they only wanted that our beliefs are the same, are the s- are
Yeah,
the,
you're right.
the uh,
Yeah, I mean, this is also true. Sectarianism is a huge issue. Um, so if you look at the history, like I said, before the modern era, scholars were writing for scholars. So even if there were like major disagreements, uh, those disagreements were between scholars, like individual scholars. It just happened to be the case that in the colonial era, with the rise of print technology and the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, um, there was a shift of sovereignty from politics to the social world. So because Muslims lost their political power, they realized that the only thing that they have is religion, the religious doctrines. So there was, and also, so since there are no sultans ruling the Muslim world, you had the ulama, like the middle class, uh, urban class of ulama, who are rising and taking the role of leadership for Muslims, because Muslims had lost political power, and there was a shift of sovereignty from politics to the social world and theology. And this is why, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, we see a rise in Muslim scholars who are devoting their energies in, uh, you know, they're devoting their energies to the social world, to the beliefs of the common people, to the practices of the common people. And if you look at the Deoband movement was not a rebellion against the colonial, masters. It was a movement that seek to uh, revive the beliefs of the people and align it with the beliefs of the Salaf, the first three generations, and also to they basically started a movement against the uh, prevailing customs, prevailing rituals of like uh, you know, uh, uh, going to darbar and going to uh, maqbaras. Um, so this is the era because the ulama are you know uh, focusing on the social world and purifying the beliefs and the practices and rituals. There was also a backlash. So this is the era where scholars are only like interested in protecting the domain of the social world and the domain of theology, like in terms of akida. So and this is why there is a rise in intensive polemical debates on akida issues, on certain customs and rituals, like glorifying saints, for example. Um, so I do think that colonial era had a lot to do with it. Um, but there are also other reasons like print. I mean, when print was introduced, then you can write for the public, like for the masses in thousands and hundreds of thousands, um, without any sort of impediment. Like they can read your work. Um, so I would
yeah,
say
print.
these were like the social and political developments that happened, which has led to this rise in sectarianism. And it's true, the sectarianism has stopped interest in Islamic intellectual tradition. And it's very unfortunate that we have these many madrasa graduates every year, but they're virtually like unaware about the intellectual tradition, the philosophical tradition, the logical tradition. They have no idea what someone like Athiruddin al-Abhari or Kutubuddin Shirazi said or what he argued, or even Fakhruddin al-Razi. Uh, Other than his theological text, they literally have no idea what he said in terms of philosophy. So, so I think this is the reason that I think I'm at least working to revive this interest in Islamic intellectual tradition, because I think this is really important. I think our tradition has answers to many of the modern problems like atheism and skepticism, etc., and other epistemologies.
Shirsha, what do you think about the madrasa system? Matlab, uh, madrasas. How do you see madrasa education and that the course of uh, Islamic teachings they teach in this madrasas and etc.
Yeah. So we have to distinguish between the pre-modern madrasa and the modern madrasas that we have right now. Like those
The,
were totally different in terms of
mm,
curriculum, in terms of the structure. They're totally different. So we cannot see we cannot use the current image of madrasa and like slap it on the pre-modern madrasa. If you look at the
mm,
pre-modern madrasa, you'll find that what you'll see is that there's a high focus on rational sciences. So I'll give one example. If you look at the Dars Nizami, which is taught in today's madrasa as well, although it is very changed. Although the Dars Nizami curriculum was never uniform, but despite that, there was a certain similarity between different madaris in that period. So the Dars Nizami was compiled by this 18th century great scholar, great logician, great philosopher, uh, Nizamuddin ibn Qutbuddin. Um, he
mm.
was he was in the era of Aurangzeb.
Right.
And he is also the founder of, I can say, you can say he was also the founder of the Farangi Mahal. Like the Farangi Mahal is the last intellectual tradition in South Asia. And like they had a massive focus on rational sciences and logic. So the Dars Nizami curriculum was prepared by Nizamuddin ibn Qutbuddin. And once he shifted to this mahal, this palace called Farangi Mahal, because it was owned by a French or I think Dutch a merchant, um, he started his school. And in that school, he started teaching the Dars Nizami. So if you look at the curriculum and you just go through a cursory look at the curriculum, you'll be amazed actually. Like it has 12 books on grammar, 5 books on logic, 7 books on usul, like the principles of jurisprudence. And interesting enough, only one book in hadith, like Mishkat al-Masabi, that was the hadith book that was taught in that madrasa. And for the rest of it, it's all philosophy, it's all astronomy, mathematics, and logic. Those are the topics that are taught. And the reason for this is that the graduates of the Farangi Mahal, they were supposed to work in government, like civil administration, etc. And this was the reason that they were required to learn rational sciences and really, train their minds in like technical language and also like technical discussions. Um, so if you look at the curriculum of the Nizami, it's super technical, it's super rational, but
It's
where
challenging,
in
right?
the late 19th century, yeah, in late 19th century, early 20th century, we see that there is less emphasis on these rational sciences, and there is an increase in transmitted sciences like hadith. And this is the time when all the 6 canonical books of hadith are introduced. There is a massive focus on tafsir, and consequently, there is a you know uh, 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 decline in focus on makulat sciences. So if you look at the like what is taught in today's madrasa in Deoband, Bareilly, and Hadith, you won't see any like much discussion on philosophy or logic. Although there are certain primary texts that are taught, other than that, there's virtually like nothing. Whereas before that, it was like filled. Like I'm not saying that this is wrong. I think that hadith and those things are definitely important. I'm just saying that it's not a good idea that those rational sciences were left uh, back then. I think those things
Yeah.
should have been developed. And if we had developed those things, Muslims would have been in a better position to answer modernity and secularism and atheism and those things. Unfortunately, today's discourse regarding these topics, liberalism, secularism, is very reactionary, and it's not robust. It's not intellectual. It's just reactionary and appealing to emotions, like quoting a verse and then So this is not uh, systematic approach to these topics. And I think the reason that Muslims are unable to answer these problems, these questions, is because unfortunately we lost that tradition, where those points, those topics about existence and philosophy were debated. Um, so okay, so we have to make this difference. There's a pre-modern madrasa, right? And you can go back to 11th century, 10th century, and you'll find a focus on the rational sciences a lot. Certainly traditional sciences as well, but rational sciences were not abandoned. What happens in the 19th century is that two things happen. First, the Dars and Islamic curriculum is watered down, so no focus on rational sciences, only traditional sciences. Two, the structure of madrasa itself goes through a radical development. So, for instance, in today's madrasa, you'll find that there's like a grading system, there's a class system, right? There is like a annual calendar year. But if you go to the Farangi Mahal, you won't find that. This idea of a graded system and annual calendar year, etc. This was adopted from the British schools, right? So when Darul Uloom Deoband was established, they adopted British school system where you had uh, a grading system, you had exams, and you had those things. Whereas in the traditional Islamic madaris, those ideas were not there. You were not supposed to give exam after learning a text from a scholar. You were supposed to learn. You were supposed to learn from scholars, like individual scholars, and they were in a compound of a madrasa. But you were not supposed to give exams or those things. There was no hierarchy, no grading system. But in today's madaris, in Deoband, Bareilly madaris, you have this, radical shift. So you now have a structure like administration and classes, exams, and the kind of career, those things, like what we have in our universities and colleges as well. So this is something that they adopted from the British schools. And why is that? Well, because Fatima Notwi and Rashid Gangoi, they were in Delhi College, and Delhi College was where the British school system was implemented. And so they had those grading systems and all that. So they liked that administrative ideas, and they just like adopted it and implemented this in their own Darul, which is why like that madrasa, the first madrasa which was established by them, it was separated from a mosque. Whereas traditionally, a madrasa and a mosque were like one; they were like same
Yeah.
compound. But in 19th century, you have that difference. Now a mosque like that madrasa is now not a mosque; it's like different. So these were the two changes that happened, which led to the madaris that we have today. Like there is no focus on rational sciences because of that, and two, there is a structural difference. Uh, so this is a history of madrasa.
If the madrasa system hadn't changed to what it is today, do you think Muslims would have been more intellectually at a better point?
Yeah, certainly. I think that any scholar you talk to who is well versed in the intellectual tradition will tell you that. So if you talk to Ustad Hassan Spider, who is on Twitter, I'm sure Shayan knows him. Um, he says the same thing. I think that we certainly lost that tradition. Uh, and if we had that, we definitely would be in a better position. I mean, just take the example of Imam Ghazali. Like, uh, I don't know if you've heard about Kalam cosmological argument, but this argument was developed by Imam Ghazali. Like, I think he was the best proponent of this argument. This argument certainly goes back centuries before him, but he was the one who proposed it in like the most robust way. And this argument was revived by a Christian theologian, and his name is William Lane Craig. And Dr. Craig is someone who is not a fan of Islam. In fact, in many points, he's attacked Islam and certain tenets of it. But he says that this argument, Kalam cosmological argument, is a solid argument. And he's a huge fan of Imam Ghazali as well because of that. And so it's very unfortunate that Muslims are like, I was like unaware of that. Oh, a Muslim scholar said this. And no Muslim today, even like I would say Qari Saab in my local mosque has any idea about this. So it's weird that we're learning our own tradition from the mouths of outsiders. And I think that's just shocking. Like you have a medieval scholar who has proposed some ideas, and those ideas, those arguments, are still relevant today. Like the Kalam cosmological argument is the most debated argument about the existence of God. So, and by the way, Ibn Sina, I don't think that Kalam cosmological argument is as strong as Ibn Sina's argument of uh, the the contingency argument. I think contingency argument is the strongest of all. Um,
Mm.
but still, like just think about it. Like these arguments are developed by Muslim scholars are now in conversation. And the funny thing is that we are not in that conversation. Like it's actually horrifying. Like we're not in that conversation. Christians are debating with atheists using arguments from our tradition. And I
It's
think that,
disappointing.
yeah, this is something we should like think about as sane people. Like we should
Mm.
revive that. It certainly has answers for today's problems. And this is just like one example. Kalam cosmological.
So, inshallah, moving on to my last question. If one wants to start their journey of studying and understanding Islamic intellectual history, what route or pathway would you suggest? Saying, the current situation of Madaris and this we it's important that Muslims today should understand Islamic intellectual history, and it's better that you should give a pathway so that our viewers and me too could understand.
Yes, the first thing is I think it's important to understand history. Like you should have an overview of how things developed and what happened. So I would say you should read the works of Professor Frank Griffin, Professor Dr. Asad Ahmed, Professor Peter Adamson. Professor Peter Adamson has this podcast. It's called History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. It has like 20-minute episode on I think every major thinker. Um, and the title is Interesting History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. So once you explore the Islamic tradition in that podcast, you will have an understanding of how things develop, and you'll see the continuity, like in post-Ghazalian period. Um, you should there are certain books. So there's one article you should read. It's called the what I mentioned earlier before we start recording. Western Reception of Al-Ghazali from the Middle Ages to the 21st Century by Frank Riffel. He has a recent book that came out. You should read all their works, I would say, but I think these are the starting points. You should read the works of Dr. Asad Ahmad. His lectures are really important on YouTube. His debate with Dr. Hudbhai is really important if you still have this belief that Al-Ghazali ended science and those things. You should read the book that I mentioned about Bayt al-Hikma. I think that is really important. And you should read Khalid al-Ruwayhib. Khalid al-Ruwayhib, Rouyheb, Ruwayhib. Uh, he has written a couple of books on Islamic intellectual tradition. And one book is a focus on 16th and 17th century Ottoman Empire. Like what were the developed, what was the state of science, rational sciences in that? And that book is really interesting. You should read the post-classical formation of the formation of post-classical philosophy in Islam by Frank Griffin. This book was published in 2020. And the two books which are recently published by Peter Adamson, The Heirs of Avicenna. Um, and there's also a series called Great Muslim Thinkers, no, Makers of the Muslim World. That's a series. And they have published many biographical texts of Muslim scholars. So there's a book on Ibn Taymiyyah, on Ibn Sina, on Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazi, and I think you should read all of them. Just have a cursory look at them to uh, appreciate this tradition. So once you're done with this historical overview, you should get into the technical, like philosophical debates that philosophers were debating that time. And I think Professor Al-Ruwayhib does a great job. Not only does he presents the history of the tradition, he also evaluates those arguments that were, debated by scholars. Like he wants to know whether the philosophy was actually robust or not. And I think this is really important. I think a lot of Muslims just want to say that, oh, we had a great tradition, like, happy. But that's not the end of it. You have to evaluate it. And I think Professor Wahid is really important in this regard. This is a rough overview. I think you'll be like once you start with the basics, I think you can carry on your own.
So we can find our own path once we
Yeah,
start.
yeah,
Well, thank you, SherShah, for sharing your invaluable insights with us today. And intellectual history has an intricate tapestry that needs to be decoded and explained via books and talks of intellectuals like you. As always, thank you for tuning in to Behind the Mic by Roshni. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the issues that matter. Until next time, this is your host, Shamal Khan, signing off. Take care.